Let us now return to Old California. So, a recap, quickly summarizing things that we've probably already talked about, just to get us back up to speed on California. Once part of New Spain, and not really settled by the Spanish until the late 1700s because it was such a far flung part of, of New Spain, which stretched from California down to the very bottom of South America. So the only reason that the Spanish started settling the area when they did is that the Russians were coming down the northwest coast, establishing forts in the late 1700s to engage in the otter trade with Native Americans, and New Spain, or Spain, was afraid that they would start to infringe upon Spanish territory. So several missions were started. And by missions, I'm talking about little communities centered around a church with soldiers sent to sort of enforce the edicts of the church and protect the members of the community. And these missions involved basically converting the local Indians and then using them as labor at the little towns that were built up around the missions. And there were half a dozen rebellions by the Native Americans in these various places in California between the late 1700s up into the 1820s, trying to retain their independence. Now, each of these little missions was named after a saint, and that's how you wound up with little towns like Santa Barbara, Santa being, feminine for saint, and San Francisco and San Diego. All right, well, in 1810, the people of California, actually of Mexico, people of Mexico, declared their independence from Spain, which Spain did not recognize, and there was about over a decade of war, a war for Mexican independence that ended in 1821, when finally there was a treaty, and Spain recognized that Mexico was an independent country. That means that now California is no longer Spain, but Mexico. And in 1833, those missions were secularized. That is to say, they were no longer using the force of the government to augment the church and forcibly use the labor of the Indians. In fact, half of all the properties were given to the Indian converts, and then the rest, remained settlements. So now that the Los Indios, the Indians of California, were no longer confined to these missions, many of them became farmers and herders independently, if they had access to their own land, or if not, kind of seasonal workers for the farms and ranches that had sprang up. And that was the new norm. Instead of everything being centered on a mission, it was now centered on the rancho or ranch, with a wealthy Mexican individual usually owning that ranch, and various both Indian and Mexican people working for them. Now, that system of ranches in the 1830s would lay the groundwork. I guess that's when you want a foundation and some groundwork. You have foundwork. Anyway, laid the foundation and the groundwork for the cowboy culture. By 1840, the ranchos that were in the place of the 21 original Spanish missions in California were running about 400,000 head of cattle. Now, part of that was used for beef, but it wasn't the primary purpose. That was not economically feasible because of transportation issues. It was hard to reach a market with fresh beef, especially up in California, which was kind of isolated. So some of it they would use to eat, but there wasn't a big population of people at that time. Some of it they would dry for shipment for sale. But primarily the whole thing was about the hide and tallow trade. So the cow hides, which would be used to make leather, which could be used for all kinds of different things, and the tallow, or the fat, which could be used to make candles and soap, and could also be used for cooking, rendered fat, lard. So that's where the money was. And there were also large private ranches that were not part of the mission slash rancho system, called large estates were called haciendas. There would be an hidalgo, or a gentleman, the wealthy Mexican that I mentioned, wealthy Mexican, usually gentleman, by which I mean I'm not sure what the rights of widows were, but anyway. Whether we're talking about the former missions or we're talking about private estates, a lot of Mexican people and some Native American people were hired to be vaqueros, which the Spanish word for cow is vaca. So vaquero, cowboy, essentially, or actually cow person. Vaquero, which would be sort of transliterated by the Anglos, by the people from the U.S. when they arrived there, who aren't real good at pronouncing foreign words in this time period. Sometimes it went from vaquero to vaquero, buckaroo, which I'm assuming you've heard that word before. Hey there, buckaroo. So that's where that comes from. One of the uses of the cow hides was to braid them into a rope that was called a rayada. Of course, with Spanish, you always have the article with a noun. So, la rayada. La rayada, which to the Anglos came to be known as a lariat. Hopefully you've heard that word before as well. If you got sent to jail in old Mexico, they would refer to it colloquially as, he's in the dungeon, or el calabozo, which became the calaboose to the U.S. citizens who came along later. Sometimes that lariat, sometimes that rayada, could be fashioned into a noose, not necessarily to hang someone, but to rope the cows. Noose or lasso, from which we get the word lasso. So, hey there, buckaroo, you better use that lariat to make a lasso, and be careful, and make sure you own the cow, or you'll wind up in the calaboose. Now, a lot of these practices and these words would make their way into the English lexicon, or at least the southwestern American English lexicon, with the cattle trade in ensuing decades. And that's because, and this is something a lot of folks don't realize, in the American Southwest during the cowboy period from roughly the end of the Civil War up through the end of the century, into the 19th century, it's estimated that somewhere between 20 to 25% of working cowboys were Latino, and another 20 to 25% were African American. And this doesn't get reflected very well in old westerns, but it was the case, and that's in large part how a lot of these words became associated with American cowboys. Well, some of the Indians who now were no longer confined to these missions, if they If they didn't have land of their own, like I said, they might go to work for someone else. And some of these employers were not necessarily native born to Mexico or Spain. In the 1820s and 1830s, there was not a large number, because there were really only about 1,000 non-Native American people in Mexican California by the 1830s, but a significant number of Europeans and or people from the United States coming into the area, just as was happening in Texas, although not in nearly as many numbers, because California is not a place where you can grow cotton the way that Texas was. But often they were coming there for the purpose of opening business ventures, which the Mexican government welcomed. People like this guy, Johannes August Sutter, who was he was Swiss, and he had immigrated to the United States in 1834, traveled along the Oregon Trail, and then worked his way southward into Northern California, where, after having to get permission from the Mexican governor, he opened a business, a sawmill, and that was located. It was a little place called Sutter's Fort that was right at the location that is now Sacramento, the capital of California. Once he immigrated to the U.S., he changed his name to sound more American, from Johannes Sutter to John Sutter. So Sutter's Mill we're talking about. Now, the hidalgos on the haciendas might frequently be prejudiced against los indios, the Indians. Some of these new arrivals were prejudiced against everybody that wasn't white, including the Mexicans in whose country they actually were, and, of course, the Native Americans. So that could be somewhat problematic. Well, it was people like Sutter who were coming in increasing numbers that were responsible for, in 1846, when the U.S.-Mexican War started, basically seizing control of California. Those Anglos seized control of California, while John Z. Fremont, alias the Pathfinder, was on his way there with a contingent from the U.S. Army to invade. The Anglo settlers seized power from within, established the Republic of California, which was a country all of its own, for 26 days until Fremont got there, in which they handed it over to the United States. And this was their national flag, which is not that different from their present state flag. You got the bear of California, which is why, by the way, you have the UCLA Bruins. A Bruin is a type of bear. I mentioned that John Sutter got permission from the Mexican government to build a sawmill on the American River in Northern California. He got that permission and started work in January 1848, and the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo that ended the U.S.-Mexican War and officially awarded California to the United States was in February of 1848. So from the time they got started, by the time they finished building this thing, they had gone from being in U.S.-controlled Mexico to the United States. Well, as they were working on this sawmill in around that time, there was I think it was in January. There was one of the workers saw some flecks of gold in the river. Turns out there was a lot of gold in the river. So this was the beginning of the California Gold Rush at Sutter's Mill in early 1848. However, the year that's associated with the gold rush the most is 1849, because Word traveled slowly back then. Took a while for word to get out around the rest of the country and the rest of the world. And also, people traveled slowly back then. So people started heading for California for those gold fields as soon as they got the news, but sometimes it took them a few months even to get there, depending on how they came. Some people came, actually about half of the people who came overland from the eastern part of the United States across the U.S. to California, and about half came by sea. Now, some of them were from the United States and sailed all the way down the eastern coast of South America until they rounded the tip of Tierra del Fuego, because there was no Panama Canal yet, and then came all the way up. And other people arrived by sea from other countries. There were people from various Latin American countries, various European countries, a lot of Australians, a few. Initially, some of the first people that arrived were from Hawaii. Well, this is a huge number of people showing up. In 1847, the year before, actually, I say the year before, it's actually more like 6 weeks before the discovery of gold, the non-Indian population of Mexico was 15,000. And some of those were Mexican-born who became American citizens when the U.S. gained the territory, and many of them were Anglos from the United States who had moved there. 15,000. Overall, by 1854, 300,000 more people came, so that the population of San Francisco swelled from about 500 in 1847 to 35,000 by 1850, and then by 1870, 150,000 people in the city of San Francisco, there on the bottom right. By that time, it was one of the largest cities in the United States, and it had been, a village, basically, before gold was discovered. Now, with all these people showing up so quickly, that is why the California territory was able to apply for statehood practically immediately and get statehood in 1850. And the process of that and the compromise of 1850 that entailed is a different story. Right now we're talking about the gold rush, though. So more people are coming in. It finally started to slow down in 1851 when there was another big gold rush in Australia. So a lot of the people that probably would have come to California went to Australia instead. Some of the people who had come to California and had not been as lucky as others headed for Australia. So that kind of slowed down the growth some. But as you can see, 150,000 by just 20 years later, it didn't slow down the growth much at all. All right. Well, in the beginning, there were even some local Native Americans who tried their hand at panning for gold, but they were in a minority, and they were kind of pushed out by this huge number of miners showing up. By December, almost a year after gold was discovered, there were 4,000 gold miners in California, and some of them had already been in California. They just became gold miners. And then in 1849, like I said, that's when people started to show up. 100,000 of them in that year. By 1852, there were 250,000, and by 54, there were 300,000. So you can see where the population growth continued, but did kind of slow down there. All right. Well, this is going to lead to some serious problems with the Native American population, with this many people suddenly showing up. 300,000 again by 1854. By the time that California became a state, there was already being calls for something to be done about the Indians. Why? Because, well, for two reasons. Number one, the Californians, the new Californians, wanted to be able to continue looking for gold in other places, including the places that were Indian country, where Indian tribes were. And number two, they didn't want the competition, and they had some extreme racism. In fact, 1849, one of the new newspapers established in California, the Daily Alta California. The editorial said, quote, "Whites are becoming impressed with the belief that it will be absolutely necessary to exterminate the savages before they can labor much longer in the mines with security." Well, in 1851, in the new governor's second State of the State address before the state legislature, he said, quote, "that a war of extermination will continue to be waged between the races until the Indian race becomes extinct must be expected. While we cannot anticipate this result but with painful regret, the inevitable destiny of the race is beyond the power or wisdom of man to avert." Well, beyond the power or wisdom of man to avert, that would be if they tried. But the California government and all these new settlers and miners didn't really try. By 1850, when California became a state, in fact, that state legislature passed and that governor signed off on a law allowing citizens, private citizens of California, to arrest Indians for various minor crimes, including loitering, and to then auction them off as slave labor. That's not the word they use. They use the term apprenticeships, forced apprenticeships, as penalty for their being arrested. Well, gee, if just anybody could claim that an Indian had committed a crime and get them put up on the auction block, I wonder how often that happened. Why, of course, that happened all the time. There was also a problem so far as the ratio of men to women in California. So by 1850, there were, I'm thinking maybe 150,000 new people had come into California. There were 7,000 non-Indian women, 40,000 Indian women, out of a population of roughly around 150,000 Native Americans in California, so adult or teenage women and older 40,000. When the mission system had been in place under the Spanish soldiers had been known for raping Native American women, or sometimes bestowing sexual favors, bestowing material favors in return for sexual favors, which the women were sometimes kind of coerced into a position that they had little choice in that matter. Either way, there had been a lot of problems with venereal disease, gonorrhea, and syphilis, to which the Native Americans had no natural immunity, just raging unchecked. It's gotten a lot worse now after these gold miners come showing up, because the raping of Native women is almost like a sport. The population, Native American population of California in 1846 was, like I said, about 150,000. By 1870, a little over 20 years after the gold rush started, it was down to 30,000. And then by 1900, it was cut in half again to 15,000. Now, the drop from 150 to 30, a lot of that was due to disease. Most of it was due to disease. It is, however, estimated that as many as 16,000 Native Americans were just outright killed by white people. Now, remember when that governor said, "Oh, it's kind of sad, but they got to pass away." How sad was it to him? Not very, because the state legislature, after first passing that law saying you could enslave Indians, basically, declared open season on Native Americans and offered a bounty for every American Indian head you brought in to the government. So this was, well, it was not only participated in by the government, but private militias sprang up to basically go hunting Native Americans. This was deliberate genocide, an attempt to eradicate a people, not just sort of secondhand by disease or things that the bearers might not be aware of or in control of, but directly from murdering people. Up to 16,000. And out of the over 100,000 who died otherwise, now some of them would have died anyway, obviously, of natural causes, but of the ones who died from disease, the primary means of transmission of this disease was raping Native women, who would then have sex with their husbands and pass it on to them. And these diseases that could be very embarrassing and debilitating for a non-Indian person were fatal for Native Americans. So this was a very dark stain in American history. Sometimes people question the use of the term genocide for Native Americans in the Americas in general. Now, the official United Nations definition of genocide that was established in 1948 to prepare for the Nuremberg trials of Nazi war criminals included not just trying to kill all the members of a group of people, but also trying to erase them from history, or to erase their cultural identity by taking away their children, not letting them speak their language. Now, that is something that was done. Some people, though, will say that, well, was that really genocide, though? No matter how you look at it, in California, it was unquestionably old school, 100% pure genocide, an effort to obliterate Native people that almost succeeded. Someone else that things became rough on were one particular immigrant group. Now, there were immigrants from all over the place coming trying to get rich in the gold fields. There also were a lot of Chinese immigrants. Now, why were there Chinese immigrants? At first, because they wanted to get rich in the gold fields. In 1849, there were 54 Chinese people in California. In 1876, there were 116,000 out of 154,000 in the U.S. So 116 out of the 154,000 were in California. From the beginning, the Chinese were singled out for terrible treatment, for prejudice. They were often easy targets because no one came to their defense and no one really did anything if crimes were committed against them. 1852, the state created the foreign miners tax that initially was $3 a month, but eventually was $20 a month. $30 a month was the average salary for a person at that time. So you can see that's pretty expensive. Technically, all foreigners, non-U.S. citizens, but guess who that got enforced on? And guess who it didn't? It was enforced on the Chinese, tried to get them to leave by making life hard on them. Eventually, 1882, Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, which was the first legislation specifically barring people from entering the U.S. and becoming citizens solely based on where they were from and what their race was. You can find lots of examples of cartoons from that time, newspaper cartoons that were pretty vicious about Chinese people. They were called various racially charged names. Celestials was one because, one of the names for China by its people was the Celestial Kingdom or Heavenly Kingdom, but that was used sarcastically by non-Chinese people against them in the United States. Also, during this time period, this was during the time of the Qing dynasty. That's how you pronounce that Q, by the way, in Pinyin transliteration of Chinese, the Qing dynasty. And that may be, these people came from the land of the Qing. That may be where a particular racial epithet that sounds a lot like Qing came from. So here are some Chinese miners. Chinese miners were frequently attacked by bands of outlaws. If they fought back, it would bring down the ire of the community if they killed white people. And then if they were killed or robbed, no one did anything about it. All right, so that's the situation socially. Let's take a look at the mining practices in Northern California and the impact that they had on the environment there. The first thing we'll look at, the simplest and most common way of looking for gold during the gold rush era, was placer mining. Now that looks like it should be pronounced placer, but it's placer. It comes from the same root word as the Spanish word plaza, which basically essentially means out in the open, an open place. So placer mining is mining out in the open. It's not really mining at all, actually, but it's out in the open, sifting through the alluvial deposits, either in rivers and streams or places where rivers and streams used to be and had dried up. So you sift through the soil, essentially, in the riverbed, and you do it in a pan. So panning for gold. This is the stereotypical means of looking for gold for the typical San Francisco 49er, which, if you didn't know, is where that term comes from. People who came into San Francisco in 1849 to look for gold. So gold is a heavy metal, all right? And gold is usually located in the mountains. However, these rivers and streams that came flowing down from the mountains and had been flowing down for hundreds of thousands or millions of years had often carried bits of gold off the mountain down into the areas where there were rivers and streams, and that those nuggets of gold, or sometimes just flecks of gold, were just sort of buried in the wet soil of the riverbed. Because gold is heavy, you could take a pan full of water and silt and just kind of slosh it around and slosh the stuff out. The gold is going to be on the bottom because it's so heavy, and that's why that works. However, that's a pretty rudimentary way to go about it, and it takes a whole lot of time to build up any significant amount of gold. So people started applying that same principle, but a little bit differently. Sluice mining. That carries the same basic principle of panning for gold, but what you do is you've got a sluice. You've got this sort of it looks kind of like an aluminum ladder with a bottom like a bed on it, or like a conveyor or something. It's got kind of this rough bumps inside, and it's kind of like this little like a little flue, not a little flue, like a big flue that you set up so that the water runs through it, and as the water runs over those bumps in the bottom of it, that catches those ridges. It catches the gold So that's using the power of the flowing water rather than standing there with a pan. Now, eventually, they started getting more creative and trying to get more quickly at the source of the gold. River mining. Now, it sounds like what we just talked about would be called a river mining because you wade out in the river with a pan. But essentially what river mining was diverting the river by getting out there, a bunch of folks getting out there and digging a trench that's going to send the river off in another direction. And then you don't have to deal with the water anymore because now you've got the river bed with all that gold in there that you can now just kind of poke through in an even more convenient way. All right, well, things got more creative. Hydraulic mining it was being used by the late 1850s. It was essentially using that river water in high-pressure hoses, really, really high-pressure hoses, directed at the side of mountains. So this blasting, essentially, with water was so powerful that it just broke apart the face of the mountain and stripped away all the soil so that the veins of gold inside the mountain would then become visible and accessible. Now this is pretty effective for getting at the actual, deposits, the veins of gold. But it was problematic because, well, for one thing, you're destroying all these mountains. That's problematic in itself. But for another thing, as you're knocking all of these rocks and all this soil off the side of the mountain, where does it go? Well, it comes tumbling down. Now, by the way, here is that same mountain in the previous photograph about 150 years later. Still scarred, still deeply scarred by that hydraulic mining. But, as I was saying, where does it all go? It gets washed down the river, right? You get a whole bunch of rocks and soil getting washed down the river. What's going to happen? It's going to dam up that river. And what happens when the rivers get dammed up like that? Eventually, that floating debris is going to cause massive flooding. The town of Marysville was completely submerged in a flood that ultimately was caused by all the debris from the hydraulic mining. Congress passed a law banning hydraulic mining in 1884. Now, if you want to look at the history of environmental regulation, most people don't go as far back as 1884. It sounds almost unheard of. But that is how serious the issue was. All right. Hard rock mining, that's what people usually associate with mines in general. That is where basically you just carve tunnels into the side of the mountain where the gold is. And you make sure, kind of similar to how they get coal, you make sure that there are wooden beams to prop up the roof so the mountain doesn't fall on you. And you get in there with picks and drills and stuff, and you just literally just dig the gold out of the side of the walls. Even then, that may seem like on the surface, you can't really see anything on the surface because it's all under the surface. But there were some unexpected problems with that as well. They would dig out the gold, and usually it's not just like pure gold there waiting for you. It's mixed in. It's mixed in with other elements and minerals and rock and dirt. It's ore. It's ore, and in that ore is some gold. How do you get it out? Well, what they would do is they would mix that ore with mercury or quicksilver. And they would then subject it to intense heat. And what they had discovered was that under intense heat, mercury bonds with, that mercury bonds with gold. And under intense heat, you burn away everything else. You've got the amalgamation of mercury and gold. And when the heat is hot enough, that mercury will evaporate, leaving only the pure gold. So that's a way, a roundabout way to get at the pure gold. But there's a problem. Things that evaporate don't necessarily stay evaporated. Even if they did, they're in the air. Mercury in high concentration is very dangerous. It can cause insanity and then death. You ever heard the expression mad as a hatter? Or, in Alice in Wonderland, the Mad Hatter. People who made hats in the 1800s, they noticed they went crazy a lot. Eventually they figured out it's because they used mercury in their hat making. Anyway, problem here is that mercury would evaporate and then, would reform condensation and become a part of the water table. So these are areas, they're the areas that are in sort of the beige color through California that today still have dangerously high concentrations of mercury. This was, it started almost 200 years ago, 170 years ago, but it continued. They continued using mercury in this way for a very long time, and it has been, like I said, very problematic.